Welcome back to AGRI 634. This week's lesson will focus primarily on crossbreeding systems and is second in a series of lectures on various mating systems. In the previous lecture we talked a lot about hybrid vigor and what that does to expected performance of crossbred individuals. So a crossbreeding system is a mating system that uses crossbreeding, that is the mating of different breeds, to maintain a desirable level of hybrid vigor and or breed complementarity. Now there are a whole host of different types of crossbreeding systems, and we're going to go through the methodology we use to evaluate different approaches to crossbreeding, and then provide you with some resources to look at a variety of different systems and then illustrate one of the systems during the course of this lecture. So there are 7 items or criteria that we use to evaluate different crossbreeding systems. So what I want to do is introduce these 7 components so that you have the tools that when you manage an operation or you are hired, you can evaluate the crossbreeding system that's in place, or perhaps develop your own crossbreeding system using these 7 different aspects of consideration relative to evaluating crossbreeding systems. And in the subsequent slides I'll go through some of the examples and explain each of these 7 components a lot more in depth. Now remember, this is a pretty basic 7-component evaluation system, and it applies to any species, whether we're dealing with pigs or sheep or beef cattle or dairy cattle. It would be the same 7 components that we look at regardless of the species. So let's get started with these. The first thing that you need to look at is the merit of the component breeds. So we've got a system we want to implement, and to evaluate that system we need to make sure that the breeds that make up the crossbreeding program are appropriate for the environment. And this is critical for it to be a successful crossbreeding system. So for instance, a composite breed in the US is Brangus beef cattle, 3/8 Brahman, 5/8 Angus. Those cattle were developed to take advantages of the strengths in Angus in fertility and milk production and relatively early puberty, good fertility, but also leverage the strengths of Brahman cattle in the fact that they are very heat tolerant and tend to have good growth rates, but they also lack in fertility. So by merging these, we could develop an individual or a breed of animals that were adapted to hotter, more humid environments and could withstand some of the challenges associated with those environments. So choosing the right breeds is critical. Now in some cases, there's only one breed that has acceptable merit, and in those cases crossbreeding is not recommended. So if you look at the dairy industry in the US, this provides a very good example of that, because we have such an intensively managed dairy production system in the US. The cattle are managed very intensively, and Holstein cattle, the primary breed of the dairy industry, exceed the milk production level of all other dairy breeds by so much. Even with the crossbreeding system, we cannot produce a cow in general that exceeds the average of the Holstein breed. Now we do get heterosis, that is an increase in milk production due in a crossbred cow, but the Holsteins are so much better to start with, it doesn't exceed their level. Now if you move to other countries where the dairy herds are not as intensively managed and more on a grazing environment, and I can think specifically of New Zealand, where dairy cattle are primarily producing on a grass-based nutrient system or feeding system. They graze grass. Okay, in those cases where animals probably cannot consume enough feed to actually express differences in milk production potential, we see a lot more crossbreeding. For instance, in that case we see Holsteins crossed with Jerseys, crossed with a number of different breeds to actually leverage the advantages of heterosis in the terms of milk production. So we see an increase in milk production, but we also see an increase in fertility. Now remember, we have a big fertility problem in the U.S., and we try to feed animals so much that we get around that. But where you're on a grass-based system, you don't have that option. So if we can take advantage of heterosis and improve fertility because we have a crossbred female, we would see that a lot more. And so we do see that a lot more in New Zealand and Australian areas where the dairy cattle are not as intensively managed. For most of the other livestock industries in the U.S., the beef cattle, the sheep, and the hogs, crossbreeding is used extensively because there is not one breed that is the best for all environments like there are for dairy cattle in the U.S. Now, you can look at a variety of sources to choose breeds that you think should go into a crossbreeding program. For instance, the Meat Animal Research Center, the USDA facility at Clay Center, Nebraska, publishes a lot of information on the differences of beef cattle breeds. The Sheep Research Center from USDA at DuBois, Idaho, does the same type of thing. So you can use scientific literature to actually identify breeds that are appropriate for your crossbreeding system. However, once the appropriate breeds are identified, we also need to make sure we can get animals to develop our crossbreeding system. And in some cases, this has been problematic in the past. For instance, we see a lot of Boer goats in this country now. They're a meat goat, and were used in crossbreeding programs in some of our more popular breeds in the U.S., but in the late 70s, early 80s, there were no Boer goats in the U.S. And the first group that got them out of Zimbabwe in Africa and through quarantine was a group in New Zealand. So those animals were very hard to locate in the 1980s and became more and more popular because of their carcass characteristics and rapid growth rate and degree of muscling. So now they're relatively popular and easy to locate, but originally they weren't, even though we knew by crossing those on our goat population, our historical goats that were in the U.S., we could improve carcass characteristics. They weren't available at that time. Another example would be the Tule. The Tule were also actually from Zimbabwe, and they're a heat-tolerant, non-Bos indicus type animal. And the Meat Animal Research Center showed that those animals actually have carcass characteristics that are superior to Angus. But Tule cattle have been relatively hard to find to use in a crossbreeding program, at least pure Tules have. They've grown more and more popular in Texas and Arizona, so they're more easy to locate now should you want to use them in a heat-tolerant crossbreeding system. But again, originally they were hard to find animals, even though we knew they would produce a superior product and a heat-tolerant product in a good crossbreeding system. Now, with that said, choosing the right breeds is going to apply to any crossbreeding system you decide to use. And so it's probably not the best criterion to compare different kinds of systems. So from here on out, we're going to assume you have the tools to actually make a good decision on the breeds you want to use in your crossbreeding system, and focus on the things that really vary between different systems. But again, to have a successful crossbreeding program, choosing the right breeds to go into that program is essential. So starting with a criterion, the first is hybrid vigor, and that is the most, or I would say almost the most important reason to crossbreed. And we talked about that in the previous lecture, how we determine the percentage of hybrid vigor we expect in a cross, and have discussed that extensively. So again, that's probably the most important reason we crossbreed, and so maximizing hybrid vigor is one of our priorities. Now we want to balance that with our second criterion, which is breed complementarity, and that is the production of a more desirable offspring by taking complementary attributes of the different breeds, and the breeds we choose, so going back to merit of component breeds, and combine those into a new animal. And that's a good example of that is the Brangus breed that I talked about earlier, where we've tried to take the attributes of Angus combined with the attributes of Brahman cattle and the weaknesses of each of those and try to offset those into a new breed that actually leverages the strengths of each to produce an animal that's more adapted to a particular environment. Now there are two types of complementarity. One is sire by dam complementarity and the other is hybrid seed stock complementarity. And I'm going to talk about both of these a little bit more in subsequent slides, but the development of Brangus as a breed is probably the best example of hybrid seed stock complementarity. Sire by dam complementarity is usually the result when we mate males that have strong genetics or genetic potential of paternal traits, so things like average daily gain, mature size, carcass weight, pick your paternal traits, and you mate those sires or those breeds that are strong in that area with dams that are strong in maternal traits. So typically we see this a lot when we implement a terminal sire crossbreeding system. So for instance, we have Angus cows that we mate to a Charolais type sire or Charolais sires. Well, the Charolais are known for lots of lean meat yield, rapid growth rate, large carcasses, and the Angus that are the females are known for fertility, good milk production, good mothering ability. So we're trying to take advantage of the strengths of the males combined with the strengths of the female breed to produce a desirable offspring. The other thing this does is it allows us to produce females that are better, or maintain a producing female herd that is better adapted to the environment and isn't as large. Angus are relatively moderate, and whereas if you had females that were primarily Charolais, you'd have a lot larger cow, a little bit harder to maintain and require more inputs. So sire by dam complementarity tries to take advantage of the strengths of two different breeds, one from the sire side and one from the dam side, to produce a desirable offspring. Whereas hybrid seed stock complementarity is produced by crossing diverse breeds to create a hybrid with a desired combination of breeding values. So, in this country, the easiest thing to think about are the composite breeds that are primarily heat adapted. So we think about the Brayford, that is a Brahman Hereford cross, the Brangus we've already talked about, the Cimbra, a Simmental Brahman cross, and then to some degree we recently have seen a growth in the Simmental Angus crossbreds, trying to take advantage of the growth rate of Simmental and the good milk potential, as well as the fertility aspects and the moderation from the Angus to produce a desirable hybrid seed stock breed, if you will. We also see this in a number of the breeds in beef cattle that are leveraging Angus. So Gelbvieh by Angus is a balancer crossbred animal or composite. Limousine by Angus crosses or Limflex composites. So a lot of the breed associations have these programs where they're trying to take advantage of the attributes of Angus primarily and combine that with the attributes of their breed to produce a desirable crossbred or hybrid seed stock animal. The next area of concern is what is the consistency of performance of the crossbred individual. And really what we're looking at in these scenarios is what is the breed composition of the product or the animals we're trying to sell relatively stable. So if we look at a variety of different crossbreeding systems, and I'll show you a number of those here later on, some of those produce animals with diverse breed composition, and that makes those animals harder to market. So when you think of consistency of performance in relationship to a crossbreeding program, think about, is the breed composition of the animals we market relatively stable from year to year to year. Now, one of the other components is replacement considerations. Some of the crossbreeding systems we will show you are able to produce their own female replacements. That is, the females are produced, come back in your herd, and are bred and spend the rest of their productive lives in your herds. Some crossbreeding systems do not produce female replacements. Now, some of them also produce their own male replacements, but most crossbreeding systems don't do that. But we'll talk about one that does. The next component that we use to evaluate crossbreeding systems is simplicity. How simple is the program to implement? And I think of this in terms of during the breeding season, how many different groups of females or breeding groups do we need to establish? Because that will determine how much record keeping you need to maintain in breed composition of individual females, so you sort those appropriately. And so simplicity is primarily how much management does it take to keep this system going during the breeding season. Obviously, when we're not in the mating season, we can commingle animals and there's not any danger of mixing or inbreeding animals. Then finally, the last component is accuracy of genetic prediction. When we talked about EPD, we talked about the ability to get a good, accurate prediction of the animal's genetic merit. Now this component or this criterion is less important as we develop better methods for genetic prediction, but historically some breeds and some hybrids simply did not have EPDs, so you were limited to phenotypic selection, which you know is much less accurate than using EPD or the results of a genetic evaluation. So this component, while we still use it, and this is especially important in some of the sheep breeds, in the beef industry this is becoming less and less of an issue because most breeds and most composites do have EPD. Now there are three primary types of crossbreeding systems, and those are rotational, terminal, and combinations of those. There's actually a fourth type that we're going to spend some time discussing during this lecture, but there are three that we're not going to discuss, but you can read more about those if you go to weeks 8 and 9, the mating systems link under readings on RAMCT, because what I did is put in a document that was developed by the Western Coordinating Committee on Beef Cattle Breeding Research that outlines a whole host of different mating systems or crossbreeding systems and the strengths and weaknesses, as well as the amount of heterosis that's retained in those systems over time. So I encourage you to look at that and to read that relative to the advantages and implementation of those various crossbreeding systems. So the type of crossbreeding system I want to spend a little bit of time with today is the idea of composites. And I'm a pretty big fan of these, just given the makeup of the U.S. beef cow herd, where a large majority of our females actually are in herds of 40 or fewer animals. And this is an easy way to take advantage of heterosis within a breeding program, even in small breeding programs. Now there's two components to composites. That is composite development, where you actually have a very large operation, access to a lot of females, and develop your own composite breed. And then there's the second phase, where once the composite's developed, you primarily are breeding that formed composite. Now there are advantages and disadvantages to composites. Composites maintain hybrid vigor very well, provided you do not inbreed. They also provide for the opportunity to take advantage of hybrid seed stock complementarity. And the unique advantage to composites is that they provide both female and male replacements. So you get the males that come back into your breeding program from this crossbreeding system, as well as the females. Most systems, or at least some of the systems, typically produce their own female replacements, but relatively few, as you would have seen reading the Western Bulletin on Crossbreeding, produce male replacements. The other advantage to composites is that they're simple once they're formed. Composite development takes a fair bit of forethought and a relatively large number of producing females to successfully implement, that is, to successfully develop your own composite. Composites can be developed to fit almost any production environment, and typically we see a lot of composites that are developed to fit harsher environments, so the tropical heat, tropical humid heat index areas, that is environments where there's a large heat challenge. We see a lot of composites developed to fit those, and we see in the western U.S. composites developed to fit the sparse forage and semi-arid rangeland environments that is typical for a lot of our western environments or western production systems. And then finally, an advantage to composites is that they can fill the role of both seed stock and commercial producer. Now, so you can develop a composite, act like a commercial producer, or act like a seed stock producer. The issue with composites typically is the availability of EPD or the results of a genetic evaluation. And as I pointed out in a previous slide, this disadvantage to composites is disappearing with better computing systems and databases that are accepting crossbred data. We now have EPD for a lot of our composite breeds. So many of you may not know what a composite is, so I guess I should explain that. A composite is a hybrid with at least 2 and typically more breeds in its background. So Brangus, as we talked about earlier, is a composite made up of 2 breeds. Brayford is a similar type of composite with 2 breeds in its background. Now, composites are expected, true composites are expected to be bred to their own kind, that is, animals of their own genetic or breed composition, with the goal being to retain a level of hybrid vigor normally associated with traditional crossbreeding systems. So, again, by developing a composite and breeding a composite, even if you're a small operator or a small producer, you're able to take advantage of hybrid vigor using this, if you will, non-traditional crossbreeding system. And the point of this slide is that composite breeds are designed to benefit from hybrid vigor without having to bring in new breeds into the crossbreeding system or source animals that are purebreds from a traditional sense. And so by definition then, if you're not having to source animals from outside of your herd and of different breeds, we get, and it makes the composite system a lot more simple to implement. And one of the attributes of pure composite systems, that is, systems that are designed for animals of a breed composition to be mated to animals of a similar breed composition, so just like almost like pure breeding, I mean, except you're dealing with a crossbred animal or crossbred population. Now, with that said, we can actually use one of the equations and simplify that to calculate the degree of retained heterosis or retained hybrid vigor in a composite. So there is a considerable amount of hybrid vigor that's retained in pure composites, and we can actually take the equation that we use to calculate percent retained heterosis or percent retained hybrid vigor from week 8 and simplify that to calculate the retained hybrid vigor in pure composites. So realizing that in a pure composite, the breed composition in the males and in the females that you're mating together is the same, we can actually say, rather than separate percentages, we just square the percentage of each of the breeds and subtract that from 1. Okay, so in this example, N is the number of breeds. So what I want to use as Brangus is the example, which is 3/8 Brahman, 5/8 Angus. We know that there is 3/8 Brahman in both the sire and the dam, so we square that. We know there's 5/8 Angus in both the sire and the dam. We square that, sum those, that's what the sigma indicates, and subtract by 1. So in that composite, we retain about 46.9% of our F1, the first generation hybrid vigor. So that's a fair increase in performance that we expect. Now, there are some other attributes of composite systems, and one of those is breed complementarity. And typically in a pure composite, there isn't much opportunity for that sire by dam complementarity that we often see in some mating systems. But I guess you could use a terminal type sire mated on a maternal type composite and see that complementarity in the offspring. What we see a lot of is actually hybrid seed stock complementarity in composites, and that's garnered or taken advantage of when the composites are originally formed by the group that is forming those. Now, composites do one thing very well besides maintain heterosis, and that's they produce progeny that are consistent. That is, the progeny all have the same breed composition, and therefore marketing those is a lot simpler than if we have fluctuating breed composition from year to year or even within a year. So these are about as consistent as purebred seed stock. Now, some of the attributes of composite systems relative to replacement considerations that also make this a very popular system is, one, they produce all of their own replacements, so they can produce male replacements as well as female replacements. So within a composite system, within your own herd, if you can avoid inbreeding, you can select your female replacements from within the herd and use those as well as your male replacements. So this makes this very similar to a purebred breeding operation. And with it similar to a purebred operation, simplicity, it's the same as for purebreds. So that's another strength of a composite system. As I alluded to earlier, the accuracy of genetic prediction for composites or new breeds, most composite populations have EPD or some genetic evaluation or have developed those over the last few years, but not all of those. Some new composites still lack a genetic evaluation system, but I see in the future with some breed associations that typically we would associate with purebreds like Simmental, they accept breed data from any breed in the U.S., any beef cattle breed, and you can submit that data and get EPDs back even if they are not Simmental. So they've tried to position themselves as an association to be the provider for composite genetics in the U.S. That said, it is a potential weakness of the system if we don't have good pedigree information and good performance information relative to getting a composite EPD, if you will. Additional strengths that are not typically associated with crossbreeding systems is the fact that you can develop a composite to fit almost any environment. And I alluded to this earlier. The other advantage is that these can play both a commercial and a seed stock role. So you may be a commercial breeder that breeds composite animals. You can select your female replacements and your male replacements from within the program. But you can also market bulls to other breeders and play the role of a seed stock producer. So composite systems actually expand your market opportunities. Now, if you're thinking of going beyond just using composites that are already formed, there are actually two distinct phases for composites. And one of those, as we talked about, is actually developing your own composite for a particular breeding program or particular environment. And Dr. Borden, one of my mentors, actually said that typically this requires at least 400 females to develop your own composite. So not a lot of people are going to do that. Most people are going to breed the composite once it's already formed. And we see that a lot, obviously, with Brangus. A lot of people use Brangus in the southern and Gulf Coast states, but that's already a formed composite. There are a few that still will reform Brangus to bring in new genetics, but most breeders use Brangus. Same way with Brayford. They're breeding the composite once it's already formed. And so remember, there are two distinct phases, but I would expect that most of the people graduating from this program are going to go into operations where they're already, if they're using composites, it's a composite that's already formed. And then finally, if you enter an operation or implement a crossbreeding or a composite system in your breeding operation, again, it doesn't matter the species, you actually have two goals, because what we've discussed this week and last is primarily hybrid vigor. Earlier in the course, we talked about improving breeding value of animals. So composite, we have a dual goal. One is to improve breeding values within the composite through selection, but we also want to maintain a high level of hybrid vigor. So whereas in a seed stock operation, your primary goal is to improve just breeding value, so if you're a purebred Hereford or Angus breeder, composite adds another level of complexity in that we want to maintain hybrid vigor. And we can do this once the composite's formed if we avoid inbreeding, because inbreeding will kill your heterosis or reduce heterosis very quickly. So what we've done is use the composite breeding system as an example to illustrate the process we can go through to evaluate systems. So notice in our discussion we've covered all 7 of those attributes that we use to evaluate different crossbreeding systems, with the exception of the merit of component breeds. We've used the last 6 actually. Now, other systems are outlined in the readings in the the crossbreeding for Western Range environments bulletin. There's a whole host of different crossbreeding systems outlined and discussed, and you could use these 7 components to evaluate each of those and whether those are systems you might want to implement in your own breeding program. So with that, we'll end the lecture on mating systems and crossbreeding systems, and wish you a good week.